Hello students, this will be a review of chapters 5, 6, and 7 in preparation for your exam on Thursday night. These chapters are fairly intricate with many mentions of different groups, different concepts, and not a lot of development under each of those specific subjects. So it's kind of tough to study for. I'm going to hit kind of an overview, and I'm going to basically try to give you kind of some broad concepts for those chapters that will hopefully help you in taking the exam, so you can see the bigger picture, and not what looks like just a lot of individual trees. So I want you to see the forest, and not get tied up with all the trees that those chapters can make you start thinking like. Let's start with chapter 5, and I think even the title is a good title to keep in mind to order your thoughts as to the difference between right-wing and left-wing terrorism, because these are ideological terrorism. They have specific political ideologies that underlie the operations of the various groups that profess to be motivated by the respective ideologies. Now, the title, On Behalf of the Sheep. And when you think of that, that means that left-wing ideologists basically often believe that it is necessary for the more elite members of a society to take care of the people in the society who are not doing very well. And usually these are the people who are poor, and actually often do suffer in societies. And it also, though, includes the working class, and that kind of becomes a problem with left-wing terrorism. It's necessary that the workers also are susceptible to falling into this basic approach to where they would join a terrorist organization. And in some cases, that's been very hard to achieve. The rest of the title, for the like-minded, and that's a really good description of most of the right-wing groups that are out there. They're based on the idea that everybody believes the same basic facts. They're self-generated facts, but they adhere to a set of facts about society, economic systems, religion. And once these facts are in place, there's little debate. In fact, one of the characterizations of these two types of groups that your text does mention is that left-wing groups are characterized by quite a bit of writing, debates, theories. They're generally, you are going to see generally a better educated group of people that get involved in these groups at the leadership level. The right-wing groups, very dogmatic, not a lot of introspection, relatively little reliance upon scholarly types of examinations. But unfortunately, there's usually a reliance upon polemical works that appeal more to their interests in racism, violence. They get an emotional hold on their members that is often much stronger than the more intellectual mode that left-wing groups often have, and which is it's different even in the way the groups can react to pressure by the government. So basically, for the like-minded, these groups are very consistent in their ideologies throughout the world, and they haven't really changed much. You don't see great changes like you will in the left-wing groups. You will see more changes there. Anyway, both groups, well, the left-wing groups desire a new world order. The right-wing groups, they often want to conserve the current order because they're worried about changes that might affect them, and they often have the concept that they are under pressure from individuals who are intruding into their society whose viewpoints on a variety of issues run counter to their dogma that they believe in, and they have a tendency at that point not to accept it. Usually, they watch the same station, they read a relatively limited set of books, and the same. It very much more rigid. Although both groups are locked in. Left-wing ideology can be similarly often locked into certain extreme positions also. All right, your text. Anyway, if you look for religious extremists, they're normally going to be in the right-wing groups. You're going to see neo-fascists, neo-Nazis. Racism is one of the major characteristics of right-wing terrorism. Some of the groups are really are hooligan-type groups. They're basically just racist or xenophobic, anti-foreigner groups who are characterized by drinking a lot of beer, socializing, rowdy street fights, and trying to terrorize people that are new to the country that these groups are part of. These groups basically, the right-wing groups more than the left-wing groups demonize people as enemies. Left-wing groups really are more consistent about a certain classes that they demonize, and those are economic classes. The right-wing groups are really looking more at ethnic and religious groups and individuals who don't adhere to certain religious tenets that they believe in. It's a different, much more fragmented group of potential victims for right-wing groups than there are for left-wing groups. All right, so we'll move into, all right. Make sure I've hit these. Your text talks about, as an example, they talk about the Baader-Meinhof gang or the Red Army faction in Germany. And that's a classic case of an ideologically based group from the left. The group believed in that communism was going to be a saving ideology. They thought that the Western civilization was evil. But in reality, like most terrorist groups, the ideology was used as a justification for what most of these small groups like the RAF really were. And they were driven more by the emotional urges that they had, the alienation that they suffer from society, and the glamour and excitement that they could achieve in their lives from being involved in terrorism. Andreas Baader, who was one of the leaders of the group, Baader was known for really believing that the presence of the gun and having sex was probably the most important thing about belonging to a terrorist group. So it's a good example of one of the groups. I think that when you read the chapters, you're going to see these examples, but for testing purposes, I want you to be able to break down these characteristics of the groups, so you're clear about the distinctions. And again, let me go over those again. The right-wing groups are generally, not always, because the European right-wing groups are not motivated by religion generally. Again, there's always exceptions to this, but generally you're going to see a lot more secular right-wing groups in Europe. In the United States, our right-wing groups have always had a religious tenor to them, fundamentalist, or basically what you would call very strange religions. The term that's often used is Christian identity, where they believe that, a variety of beliefs, but one of which was, I've got my list of their terms here. Another name for it is Anglo-Israelism. And they thought that white people, and Christian identity is also white supremacist. It is anti-Jewish, and it is anti-black, and it will be anti-Latino in certain areas. It's basically for what these groups feel are white native-born individuals whose roots trace back, for over 100 years. Although this isn't actually accurate in most cases about many of the people who are in these groups, but they believe that the white people are the actual true Israelites and descended from God. They feel that the Jewish people they feel have great control over the government. And this is consistent in the domestic groups in the United States of the right wing. They believe that they are descended from some union with the devil. Again, this is linkage to their Christian identity religion. They think that non-white individuals evolved from animals, and that Jesus himself was an Israelite, that the chosen land is where we're at now, and that he was the Son of God, but he was a white Israelite. And again, there are differences in some cases. The right-wing terrorist groups, they are not usually connected by a universal set of values. Because the groups are separate and because they're more fragmented, and in Europe that should be it for your right-wing groups. The left-wing groups are characterized by always a concern for the poor, underprivileged, and usually the intent to obtain the assistance of the workers, to get the working class, because it's a large population group. That will be the basis support that these left-wing groups, which are normally formed by an intellectual elite, they want to draw their membership more broadly and often from the working class, and that is the problem that they often have in getting that group to commit to their form of ideology. They desire new order. They're often linked to front organizations that are Marxist front organizations of some type. Today, the form we deal with today, we're looking at their concerns are anti-globalization, anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism, and generally they are anti-American. Those run, if they're anti-American, or anti-British also. That's often linked together. Their basic models are urban cells for organization. All right, so that's what you really should know, those distinctions for Chapter 5. For Chapter 6, we're looking at religious terrorism, and as you notice, your title there is Doing God's Work, and fanatics in the service of God. That's really another important concept that you should keep in mind, because that's generally how religious-based terrorist groups are motivated on the surface. And this is often a justification for, in some cases, underlying desires for power, for alienated individuals that wish to have a greater impact in life, that want to be famous, a desire for glory. In some cases, though, they are purely fanatical, driven by religious beliefs that have been inculcated in them at young ages, and in some cases older ages, though I believe at that time it's more a justification that they seize upon. But when you see these young indoctrinated individuals that started in religion at an early age, gravitated towards a fundamentalist form of that, there is a lot more true religious motivation to their terrorism that's deeply felt, and much more, I feel, much more deeply felt than it is in the left-wing groups, who can often drop one cause and move to another. Some religious terrorist groups religious individuals who, in some groups that are composed of like-minded members, they are not going to change to other causes. They're going to remain with his overriding goal of a religious order that they want to see dominant in kind of what is an eschatological battle for the end, the end game, the end times. And they want to make sure that their religious group that's going to be involved in this battle at the end times will end up reigning supreme. And usually there's a connection with the Messiah, both in Christian groups and in Islamic groups. There will be a Messiah that's going to come down and reign over the earth at that point, and that this will be in favor of these particular groups. So they've got this belief in an end times, the literalization of religion. The Bible, the Torah, the Quran, taken literally. And again, these groups, when that belief structure is inculcated at a young enough age, the idea of being able to change them is impossible. That ideology is fixed. Okay. In these groups, I think these groups, they have my example there, as opposed to groups that are ideologically, this is another major, broad, force type concept. What's the difference between political ideology groups and religious-based groups? Now, sometimes, especially in the Islamic faith, you're looking at these groups in which really politics and religion are one. So that but the religious concepts overwhelm that. With the left-wing groups, you're looking at usually a secular, non-religious form, pure political ideology. But the differences, the religious groups, they see the whole world basically as this battlefield. Clearly distinctions between good and evil, and again, you're not in adherence to their tenets of religion, often you're going to be characterized as evil, in league with the devil. Killing the enemy becomes sacralized as an actual sacred act. That you will not see with left-wing groups. The idea of total destruction is an acceptable end, an acceptable result for religious groups. That is not an acceptable result for left-wing groups. They normally want the society to be radically changed. Deaths are possible, but they want a society to continue under a new political ideology. Religious groups they will accept total destruction of a society if necessary in order to have the world cleared from the Messiah to basically create the world in the image which is that particular religious group. So it's much more of the violence potential is much greater on the extremes. The left-wing groups their violence is generally somewhat less. Now, there are exceptions to this, of course, but generally you're going to see the potential of greater religious groups. Okay, political ideology groups, define time frames. These groups don't last very long normally. They have so much time that they're going to achieve their objectives. Anything can change that. Even the government, increasing a few more rights, making political changes, that can actually cause an end for these groups. And that's but they have limited time. They have limited goals in that effect. Religious groups, their timelines are, in some cases, are almost infinite. They see the results that they want as being actually inevitable, but beyond their own lifespans. They understand that. That's part of the belief, but they do regard it as inevitable. The ideological groups, they have a real goal. It's expressed. It's political. You know what it is. root cause theory may apply. The radicalization process under the root cause theory might apply to these groups. It does not apply. Root cause theory really does not apply to religious groups because of the religious motivation itself that's driving them. It's used as pretext, but the actual application is probably not there. In fact, most of these religious groups do have a very strong, well, the larger groups do try to improve their society, but they are not, their motivation is generally generally involves really this world battle, this necessity of eliminating anyone who's a non-believer. So it's really a different concept there. Religious groups, if you had to say there's a constant, is there the idea of globalism, which is also often linked with the political ideology groups also. With the religious groups, it's secular globalism. That's what they see as the enemy, secular globalism. The idea of having a global movement and global connections, as long as they're religious-based, is not anathema to them. But secularism is, so are any form of liberal values. What we consider liberal values, freedom of belief, representative government, democratic principles, that is not what they believe. They reject those values. They want to be ruled by religion. They feel that it is a better system, and it is the system that, that it's the system that's given to them as the divine system from God. Okay. They reject moderation. They fight against any invasion of Western culture. And they believe in God's law, God's will, over any type of secular or positive legal system. Okay. And in your text and chapter, it talks about the Turner Diaries, which Turner Diaries serves as sort of almost a Bible for some of the more secular. Actually, in the religious groups, they take the religious domestic groups in the United States take the Turner Bible, and when you read the Turner Diaries, basically it treats the book is written with religious overtones. It appeals to a broad frame of Christians. It's not specific, but it gives some general principles. Okay. All right. I think that's the main aspect that I wanted to go over in regard to the religious-based groups. And finally, the last chapter, chapter 7, the financial crimes. On that chapter, for that, I did want to, there's a distinction here between the linkages of the different organizations. We now have the criminal terrorist organizations and the traditional terrorist organizations, and the fact that they've often become hybrids in which it's either criminality or terrorism. In some cases, they can flip in that a group that's originally a terrorist group converts to purely a criminal group with terrorist overtones, or vice versa. Remember there's clear distinctions, though, in regard to a purely criminal group and a purely terrorist group. Now those, when we look at criminals and terrorists and the groups that they're composed of, the criminals are opportunistic. They're looking for opportunities that come up. Terrorists, they have planned objectives. They have goals. The criminals, really, truly uncommitted. Terrorists, there's an ideology, political or religious ideology. The criminals, self-centered, looking out for number one. Although this is often true in terrorism, that those tendencies are groups tried to eliminate those tendencies and merge them into this one group mind that's group focused, not individually. They do not want individual thinkers in terrorist groups. Generally the criminals, there's a flip here, that sometimes they're untrained in some of the more tactical approaches, but they may have skills like breaking into cars or houses that may be necessary in a terrorist campaign. Now the terrorists often have been trained, often recruit people who have military training or police training. They also engage in their training programs that they can go through, and they have the internet to help them get. Training is important to them. Very few criminal groups do a lot of training. Terrorist groups do. And lastly, criminal groups, they are escape motivated. They're looking out at one point getting away. The groups will fragment relatively easy if they're close to being apprehended. They look out for number one. They're going to break up the organization real quick. They're escape oriented. They would break up their organization. The terrorist groups are not. They will fight. They are more attack oriented. There's less. Now they will break up, but there's more of a sense of trying to maintain the connections when they break up. There's usually plans to where they'll get together again because they want this to go on. They want it to go on. That's an important concept to remember. The other important concept is when you look at the finances, I think the text was very good in explaining that despite all of our tracing of financial, through the financial markets, the money laundering systems that are used out there, that they say the major problem they're focusing on is zakat and hawala. And that is important because in the Islamic groups, and in some of the Christian, and actually there are relatively few, there was a relatively small Jewish terrorist movement in Israel. So I'm not going to really go into that, but we look at the Islamic groups because more than the Christian groups, the Islamic groups, because of the Islamic society, that principle of zakat that everybody gets, it's basically a tithe that everybody pays in their society, and it goes to a variety of charitable organizations, which often donate to front organizations for terrorist groups, and the money is funneled to them. This is enormous sums of money. You have Muslims all around the world donating into these groups. They're required to by their religion. So you have funding that is almost impossible to trace. We have systems to do it, but it's very, very tough to do. The other part is hawala, which is basically a term used for an informal type of money transferring system in which you don't go through the legitimate cycles. You've got these money handlers set up in which you can basically, they often use coded tokens where you can go to a money handler and ask for money to be sent, and that money is actually not physically transferred. There's a way that accounts are regulated so that on the other hand, someone can come in with a particular token, accept that money, and then the accounts between the two respective money handlers, they keep a balance of that. So this money cannot be, it's very hard to physically intercept this or trace it. So zakat, which funds these systems, and hawala, which again is more generic for a variety of really informal ways to transfer the money, that tries to eliminate the enhanced methodologies that Western governments have been using to try to trace funding. They're relying more on these ancient systems because these systems have existed for thousands of years. It's important to remember that. The last thing as far as how these groups, terrorist groups, get involved into criminal activities, three basic ways. They can be basically predator. Their predator system is where they actually rob. They rob banks, jewelry stores, the rough. They take diamonds. That's a predatorial system. They're actually going to take it. They can also function in basically a system in which they are symbiotic. Well, first from predator, let's move to parasite. They're a parasite. You have an active drug operation going on. They latch on. We'll furnish protection. You've got to pay us. Okay, that's another basic system. In the third system, though, is where they actually become symbiotic. They merge into the system. They're actually part of it. You could look at the FARC for this, the Colombian FARC for this. They actually do both symbiotic and parasitic systems. They're both part of it in some cases. In other cases, they're purely parasitic. Those are the major components, the major things that you should know for the exam. And good luck, and I'll see you on Thursday.